Good morning, and thank you for joining today's program. In Solidarity, in Strength is a webinar series launched by the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles to support Israel and the Jewish community during this historic crisis. Through weekly webinars, participants gain an insider's perspective on Israeli resilience, the recent surge in anti-Semitism, firsthand accounts of those impacted by the war, the Jewish community's ongoing organizing, and much more. This educational series features subject matter experts who will provide ongoing learning opportunities to make us more informed as we collectively work to support Israel. Today's webinar is Dissecting Disinformation, Israel's Virtual Battlefield. Since the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th, the internet has been a key source of information, both factual and fabricated, about the conflict. Today, we will hear from experts on the front lines of the digital campaign to spread disinformation and sow discord among the international community, and how we can sift out truth from the half-true and the untrue. We will also learn more about how disinformation is morphing into anti-Semitism and what that looks like in a virtual space. We invite you to submit questions throughout this morning's conversation using the webinar's Q&A function, and our moderator will direct them to today's panelists. Please welcome our moderator for today's conversation, Brian Levin, Commissioner on the California Commission on the State of Hate and former director of the Center for the Study of Hate at Cal State University, San Bernardino, though today he speaks only in his individual capacity.
Thank you, Zev, and thank you all for joining today's conversation. Thank you to Joanna Mendelson, Senior Vice President, Community Engagement of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, which I just call JFED, by the way, for the opportunity to moderate today's discussion. I'm going to slip in something that I didn't tell anyone from the Jewish Federation, though, about her. And this is not disinformation. The last thing I did before I retired from the center in August was to bestow Joanna with our Daybreak of Peace Award. And that's genuine. In any event, before I introduce today's panelists, I do want to take a quick moment to share some of my latest findings and also to say a few words about solidarity with the Jewish people here in California and around the world. Here in the United States, we are coming off 2022, which was the second worst year for anti-Jewish FBI reported hate crime since 1993. And my former center found at least a 12-year high with respect to anti-Jewish hate crimes in major American cities. However, if our early numbers for October, which we're getting from all over the world, and it's not my presentation, it's theirs today, but I do want to share this. This is the climate we're in when this disinformation is happening. Our early numbers for October from major U.S. cities, if they extrapolate nationally, could very well be a record, certainly a decade high at the very least. I think we're looking scratching or peaking over records, but up 175% anti-Jewish hate crime in Los Angeles this October versus last. New York City, 214%. We're seeing similar increases, Toronto, Montreal, London, but there are just a few things. I do want to, before we go to the panelists, though, I open my heart to all who are experiencing the unspeakable grief arising from October 7th's orgy of butchery and Jew hatred at the hands of anti-Semitic Hamas terrorists in an act of depravity towards Jews the world has not seen since World War II, back to a time when indeed my father and many others were imprisoned by the Nazis. Every Jewish family has a story. Almost 6 decades ago, a play about a Jewish fiddler on an uneven roof struck a visceral chord for Jews around the world, for just as Tevye and Golda's voices interlocked in a heartfelt duet at their daughter's wedding. Russian Cossacks brutally killed and attacked at the ceremony while ransacking the town. The fiddler on an uneven roof is but a metaphor for the balancing act we all must achieve between the sweetness of life's joys and the risks of its sudden, sometimes horrifying perils, like the violent Jew hatred we have just seen. I want my Jewish brothers and sisters at the Jewish Federation and beyond to know that as I navigate this uneven roof with you, often in the rain, I offer my outstretched arms to help steady our balance, just as I proudly have for decades. Well, on that note, let's have me quiet down and speak to today's very interesting panel. And let me tell you who they are. Yuri Neves is an analyst at Moonshot. I just saw your director about a month ago on the East Coast. Moonshot works to better understand and disrupt disinformation networks on the internet. Yuri focuses on understanding and evaluating domestic violent extremism, DVE, online and analyzes dozens of social media platforms, millions of social media posts, and extremism-related geospatial search data each month. And my son barely trusts me with the remote. Alexandra Levine is a senior writer at Forbes, covering technology and society with a focus on social media. She previously spent 3 years as a tech reporter at Politico and 3 years as a staff columnist at the New York Times, and has discussed her work on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, CBS, NPR, and BBC. Rachel Lester is a decorated veteran of the spokesperson's unit of the Israel Defense Forces, having served several years as both an active duty lone soldier and civilian employee. After October 7th, she was called back as a reserve and is serving in the same unit, producing countless videos and social media content for the IDF. A Los Angeles native and let's get this right. Boy, we don't want to cause any more rifts here in the world. A native Angelina and a graduate of USC and Reichman University in Herzliya. Her videos have gone viral numerous times. Well, if I can start with Alexandra, if you can tell us what the digital landscape looks like following the October 7th terror attacks and the ensuing Israeli response in Gaza. Can you paint us a picture of what the discourse looks like 40 days in now to this conflict?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on this webinar today, Brian. So on October 7th, I think what we saw from social media was really twofold. On the one hand, obviously, social media brought the horrors of the day into everybody's living room around the world. Hamas weaponized social media on that day to terrorize people in ways that we've never seen social media used before, to terrorize victims, to terrorize their families. But just as much, social media on the other side was really important for people around the world to bear witness to what was going on, for people who were affected to find any information, to glean anything that they could about family members who were missing or friends or relatives who were missing. And it also was a way that people who were experiencing the atrocities of October 7th were able to document everything that was happening in real time. So as horrifying as social media was on that day, I think that looking at the landscape now, roughly 40 days in, things have actually deteriorated, in my opinion, online. First of all, I think we can all agree that it is so difficult to separate anything that we see on social media, fact from fiction. Even from a journalist point of view, I'm somebody who is sort of trained to do this. I live and breathe it every day in my job. I can't even tell sometimes. And to be frank, there's a lot of journalists who are constantly talking offline. Do you think this is true? Do you not? Like, should we share this? Should we not share this? And these conversations are really important, but they're happening in real time, and they're happening as things are moving incredibly quickly. And there's, in the interim, there's also the mass spreading of misinformation. So that's one thing. In the immediate aftermath, I've also seen a lot of harassment of victims of people who were killed, their social media accounts being trolled, abused, with commenters posting things often before they were not even, properly buried the week after or in the weeks after the attacks. I have also noticed quite a lot of fake accounts and anonymous posts that are on mainstream social media platforms like Facebook, and then also more sort of niche social media platforms that are just tailored to college students, that are really riling up people on college campuses in all corners of the conflict, not necessarily convincing people to take sides, but more just trying to get college students even more fired up and angry at each other than they already are, which unfortunately is not something that it's something that we've seen before during really high stakes major national and global events like elections. But college campuses are now becoming sort of this new frontier this new frontier for outside agitators, potential outside agitators, to kind of wreak havoc and sow discord. All of this, I think, is kind of against the backdrop of Instagram being a place where we are all connected really with people that we know or people that we have, loose connections with, which means that the effects of having, echo chambers where we're just continually seeing and then amplifying people's views that really, are in line with our own. I think that can be incredibly dangerous, especially in events where it's important for misinformation to be sort of spotted and then tamped down before it can really cause harm. And then the last thing I'll say is that TikTok is really this is a major this is probably the second major TikTok war. Last year being there was a lot of there was a lot of use of TikTok and reliance on TikTok for information around the Ukraine-Russia war last year. But with TikTok now, TikTok is a platform where people are not really following only people that they're friends with, that they're acquaintances with. It's really what is being amplified by algorithms, what is out there that is going viral for people that we all don't even know. And I think that the fact that that a platform like TikTok, which is increasingly becoming a place for young people to get all their news from, can be incredibly dangerous and volatile during a time like this, because these algorithms are driven more by engagement, which I think relies more heavily on sensationalism than fact in either direction.
Brian, sorry, we have you on mute there.
So I was so engaged listening to Alexandra. I apologize. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for that elucidative discussion. Rachel, and you're the first person active IDF person that I've interviewed. So this is, I think, something that people want to hear about and hear from you on. You're on the front lines of a virtual online conflict. Can you share what your work as a spokesperson looks like and what you consider your role to be? In addition, just stretching that out a little bit, what does the digital landscape entail for you and your unit, particularly as disinformation and distrust on social media runs rampant? And we're seeing this increase in religious divisions, all at a time when very real and graphic depictions of some of the thousands of Palestinian civilian casualties are even at the extent now of causing subtle rifts even amongst steadfast allies. And as a poll out today seems to indicate that support since the beginning of the conflict for Israel has declined. So in this very complicated and highly charged situation, how do you see the conflict? What do you see as your proper role? And how do you respond to not only the disinformation and the atmospherics around that, but some of the graphic imagery and data that's coming out of Gaza and Israel?
Sure. So I'll start by giving you all a basic overview of how this international spokesperson's unit is built. We have 3 departments. We are the international press department, so the people who are in constant contact with reporters from newspapers and news channels, the public diplomacy desk, so the liaisons between the IDF and members of Congress, for example, AIPAC, big organizations like that. And then there's us in the social media office, as you said, on the front lines of the digital war. So we run the IDF's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, LinkedIn, and website in English, Spanish, and French. So I would say that as the international social media office of the IDF, we have 2 main goals. We have the goal of being the official source of news about the IDF, and that presents itself as just informative tweets and updating about operational activity in real time. And the other is, as I said, the digital war, because social media and the way that people form opinions, not just everyday people that are consuming content around the world, but decision makers, policymakers, world leaders. Social media is the first step to either giving us or not giving us legitimacy to act on a larger military level. So I create a lot of the videos that you see on IDF social media. It's my job, and the job of other soldiers with me, to tell the story of what the IDF is doing in a digestible, social media relevant way. So sometimes that means that what's going up on Twitter is different than what's going on TikTok, etc. And besides that, it's also very much our job and responsibility to monitor what people are saying on all the different social media platforms, and do my best to create content to fill in the gaps, the voids of what people aren't talking about that we think they should be talking about, and combat misinformation, as you said. So part of that right now is so much just making content that is what is or who is Hamas on a 101 level, on a very basic level for people who didn't know anything about Hamas until a month ago, and who we're fighting and why, because the memory of October 7th is already faded for so many people, and it's our job to remind the world why we're fighting this really unpleasant war to begin with. So in a nutshell, I would say that I start every day by asking myself, what does the world need to know about the IDF today, and how can I tell that story? So that's what we all do in the unit, in 3 languages, 7 platforms, around the clock. And I think that given the circumstances of a very, like I said, unpleasant to say the least situation that the Middle East is in right now, I think we've been doing an amazing job at not only getting information out in real time, but also, being, I guess, relevant on social media when we need to be relevant, being sassy when we need to be sassy, and getting the attention of people around the world to, share our narrative of what we're trying to convey to the world.
Can I just quickly follow up, because there's just something you said that you're a source of news, but as the father of a fledgling journalist, you're a source of news, but you also have a position in this conflict. Does that create a conflict of interest? And again, let me broaden it out. I think that would be true of the press office of the Department of Defense here in the United States. So should people view you as like an independent anchor with the news, or more like a sportscaster who's rooting for a home team? Just because you
That's a great question.
Yeah,
I would definitely not claim to be unbiased. I don't think anybody who tells any narrative on social media is unbiased. Our job is to report, is to be a source of facts in situations where we're breaking news. There's a lot of things that you'll see if you go on the IDF Twitter that is solely just numbers, data, information. And then there's the other part of our job, which is the narrative. And so we, that's our job every day, to combine the 2 aspects, which is what is the objective truth and what is the narrative of the situation that we want people to understand. So it doesn't mean that we're going to say, yeah, nobody in Gaza is dying. That's of course not true. But the narrative is, why are people in Gaza dying? The reason for that is because Hamas, the terrorist organization that runs the Gaza Strip, is intentionally placing people in harm's way in order for them to die. So that's the context that we try to have people understand when we present, our narrative on social media. Because, you could always have 2 sides to every story, but we feel, that the side that we need to tell has a lot of context that other people who are trying to be unbiased might be missing in that attempt to be, even-handed, because we're not fighting an even-handed fight. We're fighting a terrorist organization.
Wow. I would love to ask you so many more questions, but we have a wonderful, so maybe we can get back on some things here, but that did give me some information. In other words, that you are presenting it from, you don't view yourself as much, well, I shouldn't say, it's not so much as a news organization. You're coming from a perspective of a narrative that you want to highlight, that you think is not necessarily getting appropriate attention.
It's both. It's absolutely both. We post things that are just numbers, just data, just updates, because that's part of the job. And then part of the job that I think is different than, as you mentioned, the U.S. Department of Defense. The U.S. Department of Defense doesn't need to legitimize and justify everything they do to an incredibly critical audience and world stage. So we take the objective facts that we have from military intelligence and, you know, reporting that's going on the ground, and we convey it with the narrative that we think is important for the world to know as they're reading these facts.
It almost sounds more like the op-ed section, but I'm going to move on hopefully we'll have time to get back and we'll get other folks' questions. I really get opportunities to question government officials of any stripe. So it's always interesting to me. Now I get to question someone of the ilk that I always talk to, which is researchers and academics, and Moonshot is a wonderful example, I think, of both. Yuri, you track extremism online. How have extremist groups been reacting to the war between Israel and Hamas, and what's driving those responses?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having me. I think the first thing to point out is that this is firmly the center of the attention in the extremist ecosystem online now. We haven't seen these levels of discussion since the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia war. And one thing that we're really noticing is significant support for Hamas, particularly among neo-Nazis and white supremacists. So this takes the form of, cheering on the attacks, celebrating the deaths of Israelis and Jews, and sharing some of that graphic footage that has come out, and just hoping for Hamas to succeed in the war and ultimately, in destroying all of Israel. Now, for the most part, most of these groups, they're not particularly focused on the Israel-Palestine conflict or the history there in the region, but these groups are obviously very anti-Semitic, and so that helps explain their support for Hamas. But that's only part of it. So they also view groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah as fighting against what they perceive as a morally corrupt, liberal, Western-led order in the world, and Israel is seen as a part of that. So sometimes you see this with other groups outside of this conflict. For example, we saw lots of support for the Taliban when they took over the country. Another interesting and really concerning thing that we're observing is calls to learn from Hamas from the initial attack on October 7th. So some groups have been discussing the tactics and the possibility of conducting a similar attack in the US in the future. And this is mostly coming from groups who sort of fantasize about this race war where they overthrow the US government and institute, take control of the country. Some extremist groups have also been sharing Hamas and axis of resistance propaganda. This happens particularly on Telegram. So they just reshare posts that these terrorist groups are making on the platform. And also sometimes they take the clips that are put out by Hamas and they, create their own video compilations of that. And at times also sort of mix neo-Nazi imagery with the imagery of Hamas to sort of demonstrate their support for the group. And then moving on to the real world, what we have seen is some neo-Nazi groups attempting to sort of co-opt the pro-Palestine movement for their own ends. So these groups are appearing in public places with signs criticizing the actions of the Israeli state. But also alongside that, we're seeing they have anti-Semitic signs that reference sort of long-standing white supremacist conspiracy theories that blame Jews for immigration, for a number of things. So what they're really trying to do is they see that this is in the public sphere. They see that there's these demonstrations, they get media coverage, and they sort of just want to latch onto it to spread their anti-Semitism. This isn't new. These kinds of groups have done that in the past around other issues, immigration for one. And also it's important to note that these groups, they're very racist and Islamophobic. So they would happily, commit a hate crime against the Palestinians. So it's not out of a sense of, interest in the issue. It's just they're very anti-Semitic, and they're viewing this war as an opportunity to spread their anti-Semitic hate and maybe get others onto their side. And just one last point, on social media platforms, particularly on X, what we've seen is that conspiracy theorists, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis have been very active commentating on the conflict. And some of them are probably achieving more prominence than they had before because there's users who may or may not be aware of who they are or sharing some of their criticisms of Israel's actions during this war. And so people online may not know who they are, and they're sort of trying to couch their criticism as it relates to this war. But these are really just people who are very anti-Semitic generally and neo-Nazis. And unfortunately, I think people who aren't aware of who they are, they've been sort of boosting them during this conflict, which is very concerning to see. I believe you're on mute, Brian.
Thank you so much. Wow, if you do it twice, shame on me again. Thank you so much. Rachel, I could get back to you a second. You know, in the fog of war, it's not always clear to us on the other side of the world what's happening in real time. Can you tell us about some moments where facts on the ground haven't been fully or even partially reflected in news coverage? Something brings to mind something from the BBC, where the way they worded something was totally incorrect and sounded like civilians were being targeted when it was actually they were talking about physicians coming in. But nevertheless, there have been other instances that haven't been so clear cut, and indeed ones where Israel does not look like a beneficial actor in a particular situation, particularly when there's casualties. So how do you balance these? And what are some of the moments that you've seen where the facts on the ground just weren't reflected in either news coverage overall or social media? And thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the best example of this that in my opinion, and one that I think will go down in history books, was the coverage of the explosion at the Ali Hospital on October 17th in Gaza. As I'm sure most of you remember, at about 7 p.m. local time, there started having some reports started coming out of Gaza about an explosion at a hospital, and Gaza's Ministry of Health, which is run by Hamas, immediately reported 500 dead, and that it was due to an Israeli airstrike. So I will never forget what was going on in, behind the scenes at that point, because it was immediately clear to us that something was suspicious. And I was just kind of watching in the WhatsApp groups of, all of the people higher up in our unit, starting to reach out to their different sources to be able to put out, a statement about what actually happened. So first it was the response from the Air Force that we didn't strike in that area anywhere near that time, anywhere in that remotely, close location at that time. Then it was a confirmation from intelligence about, what actually turned out to be the reality, which was that it was a misfired rocket from a terrorist group in Gaza that they tried to launch at Israel and fell short and landed in Gaza. So I think that was a really crazy example of where, the entire world taking the Ministry of Health, which is Hamas, at face value immediately and running, they say that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has time to tie its shoelaces. And we really saw that night, or day in the US, as every major news outlet started covering exactly what Hamas put out. They were saying Israeli airstrike. If you can go back and see that the headlines at the initial, the initial outset said Israeli airstrike kills 500 at hospital. And then slowly, as we started coming out with information, they started changing to, Israel says that it was not them. And then when the facts actually became clear, I think it was a matter of 4 hours between the initial report and us putting out a definitive statement that we knew from multiple sources, Air Force, intelligence, also just open source intelligence on the ground, being able to see the video, how it was, a misfired rocket and did not come from an Israeli airstrike. All the news sources, scrambled to change their headlines, change their articles, and updating in real time as the information came out. And I think that the world learned a big lesson that day, which is that we're all incredibly susceptible to believing the first thing we hear without any real proof. And I think all of the news organizations that fell for that as well were very humbled when they realized that they had fallen for a complete misinformation, war tactic by Hamas, which is just make a claim now and back it up later. And it became very clear within a matter of hours, if not by the next day, that nowhere near that number of people were killed, that the area surrounding the explosion could not have been affected by an IDF strike. That it just did not look the same. And I think that since then, news organizations, reporters who made those mistakes have been a lot more careful to clarify in headlines and in articles and on the news, saying attributing their sources, first of all, and saying, Hamas says, or the IDF says, or, claims or reports, as opposed to just stating things as facts before they have the information. And I think that it marked a really big change in the way that news is coming out of Israel and Gaza that night.
All right, thank you. But what I just add is that even if you excise the imagery coming out, when your staunchest allies like Tony Blinken says far too many Palestinians have been killed, I wonder if you're failing to communicate on two fronts, maybe with respect to, yes, taking those individual examples, but the consistent coverage is affecting even among your allies. But wow, thank you for that. If I could go for a second to Yuri, I'm sorry, to Alexandra rather. How are wartime journalists covering quickly developing stories? What are some of the ways disinformation informs news coverage, and what does that look like the past few weeks?
So I admittedly am not a war correspondent. I'm based in the US. I cover mainly technology and social media. So for me, the coverage has looked a little bit different. I am always looking for how social media is fitting into fitting into the war, how it's shaping discourse around the war, how it is affecting, in this case, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the United States now. And so some of the stories that we've done in the last few weeks have been about Israeli startups, for example, that have deployed their founders to serve, and how the startups are, figuring out how to balance the business with people going back to the front lines. Another story on how schools were encouraging families to have their children delete social media en masse to protect them from seeing the execution videos that Hamas was threatening, and also to prevent them from seeing other graphic imagery that has been literally everywhere. I wrote something this past week about how social media and fake accounts and anonymity are being used to just create chaos on college campuses, turn people against each other. And then just before I jumped on to the webinar this morning, I was doing some digging on text messages that apparently family members of hostages have been receiving from unknown numbers. And these messages are claiming to be from Hamas, and they are claiming that they have information about these family members, their hostage relatives, and making demands. And it appears we're still trying to verify whether this is something we can really continue reporting on. But we're finding a lot of really interesting information about this, and it seems like it's psychological warfare, and just these threats are coming from these masked numbers, and it's really hard to know where they are coming from. But there is certainly also a possibility that it's coming from outside of the Middle East. So anyways, these are all the types of stories that, like, as a tech reporter on my beat, we're focused on right now. Like I said, I am not a war correspondent, but I think that, as Rachel has said, focusing on how social media is figuring into all of this is incredibly important as we figure out how things are being documented, how stories are being twisted, et cetera. The other thing I want to note is that the example that Rachel gave about the New York Times coverage of the hospital bombing, I agree. I think that one will go down in history as really a game changer, and I think that it changed the way that journalists everywhere are proceeding, with future coverage of the war. I do want to stress, though, that there is still a really high bar in most, at least every newsroom that I've worked in, including the one that I'm currently working in. There's such a high bar for verification before we share information. And it's not just the onus is not only on the news organizations as a whole, it's also on the journalist personally. So I get messages all day, every day, from people asking me to share information on my Instagram, for example. And I also get questions about how can we help. There was one message I got the other day or is actually a number of messages I got the other day, people asking how can we support a young boy whose family was killed, his entire family had been killed on a kibbutz on October 7th, and he's now growing up by himself, and how can we support him? Is there a GoFundMe? And there was a GoFundMe link that was circulating, and I, before sharing it on my social media, to encourage people to donate, I wanted to make sure that the GoFundMe page was legit, and I wanted to make sure I understood how the person who had organized it was planning on actually getting those funds to this young boy, not knowing necessarily who his guardian would be at this point. And I went down this rabbit hole and discovered that the person who had organized the GoFundMe for this person and collected, I think, probably north of $30,000 at that point within only like a day or two. He had never made contact with the boy. He didn't know how to find the guardian. He was very well-meaning. He really just wanted to help, but he ended up, not having any way to get the money to the family. And then finally, I think days later, he reached somebody who knew the young boy, and the family said, we don't want anyone's money. We just want people to support the IDF. And so he decided that he was going to return the, $30,000 to everybody who had donated. I think, again, this is just one example of why it's so important to fact check things, to make sure that before, any journalist, whether it's somebody acting on their own personal Instagram account or publishing something on behalf of a news organization, the bar for like what we share, what we publish is actually incredibly high. So I just wanted to stress that.
Thank you. Yuri, the Jewish Federations of North America had released a poll which showed 70% of American Jews are more concerned for their safety now than before October 7th. Is what you're seeing in your monitoring supporting these concerns? How is fear being sown online?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just as a little bit of context, so Moonshot produces a monthly threat bulletin, which takes a look at hundreds of domestic violent extremist spaces online, dozens of platforms. And for this, we write about narratives, development of tactics, searches for extremist content at the state and county level. And importantly, and related to this, is we analyze threats to various groups, including ethnic minorities, politicians, government officials, and others. And so what we saw last month was quite shocking, actually. So we saw nearly 25,000 threats of violence against Jewish communities. And this is actually a 425% increase when compared to a baseline of the previous 6 months of data. And also important to note that this is at an unprecedented level. This is the highest number of threats.
Could you just repeat that? Could you just repeat the number? Because there are a lot of people who, when they're looking at it, that sounded very significant. And I apologize about interjecting, but if you just repeat that number, I thought that was terrifying.
Yeah, so this is and it is important to note, this isn't across all of social media. We monitor specific extremist spaces, whether that's on extremist platforms or whether that's, extremists on mainstream platforms. And so we found that there was roughly 25,000 threats of violence against Jewish communities. These aren't all direct threats to violence. Some of them are, encouragement to violence, incitement to violence, hoping for violence against these communities. But this was a 425% increase compared to a baseline of the previous 6 months. And it's the highest level reported by the threat bulletin since we began February 2022. And it's the highest volume of threats recorded against any monitored group. So typically, threats against Jewish communities are consistently the highest month on month, but this is just far and above that. Important to note, too, that it's also last month was also the highest number of threats were recorded against Muslim communities. So you can see how extremists are really involved in this conflict, and really it's causing violent rhetoric to surge in general. What we have seen, just to dive into some of these specifics, what we're seeing is calling for the death of Jewish communities and the use of violent anti-Semitic slogans. These are becoming quite popular quite often. We're seeing some pro-Palestine rallies that are being celebrated in DV spaces, I know that's mostly some of these extremists online. They're very happy that these some of these rallies are causing distress to Jewish communities, and so we're seeing calls for further demonstrations to take place, specifically targeting Jewish neighborhoods and outside synagogues. And again, this is what I said before. Really, the motivation for this is these groups are very anti-Semitic. These audiences are very anti-Semitic. And so when they see things like this that cause distress to Jewish communities, they really just want to amplify that. So I think some of the concerns that you listed in that poll, I think they're very well founded.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Alexandra, for those of us who aren't journalists, it can seem like reading the news and finding out what's happening halfway across the world can be two different efforts. How do we sort out the news from the quote fake news, which I don't like that term, but what can we do to be responsible consumers of the news? And particularly just to reference back the mistake made with regard to the PIJ rocket that misfunctioned, but also by the same token, by the fact that a lot of journalists are not in areas where we are not witnessing what is happening with respect to, for instance, the IDF, who can restrict who can come in and go out into certain areas. So how do we dissect, on the one hand, looking at what's going on when there's misinformation, but also when there's issues with regard to the flow of information and how graphic it is and how representative it is? Thanks.
Sure. So I think that this is sort of trite, but probably the most important is just think before you share, and think about what it is you're consuming, and don't move so quickly. I think, when any group or individual is sharing things that are probably well-intended, just to show solidarity or to try to spread, authoritative, accurate information, we all still really have to look before we leap. We have to verify as best we can what we are sharing before we share it. There's a lot of, I sort of call them Instagram journalists. There's a lot of people who have taken to Instagram to be like the people delivering information. And I think that is, I absolutely believe in people using their platforms. I just think that people who are building these enormous followings on whatever platform they're using, by being the go-to, news source, they have so much responsibility to be sure that they are getting it right. So that's one thing, is just to be cognizant of what you are sharing and to not move quickly. I think it's really important to look at sourcing with anything. I think Rachel called this out earlier, but the Gaza Ministry of Health, they are run by Hamas. And I personally think it's irresponsible for any person, whether it's, an Instagram journalist or whether it's somebody who's working for a news outlet, to be writing or speaking about that source without calling out and making very clear to the average person who may be following or reading that that the Gaza Health Ministry is run by Hamas. So I think that we always need to be cognizant of like who the source is, what their motives are, think about why they're putting out the information they're putting it out, where it's coming from, and knowing why they're putting out these numbers or this information, what kind of message they're trying to get across, I think is all really important as people are consuming information. I think it's also incredibly important for people to try as best they can to seek out information from outlets that they don't typically read. I think that, that is of course how we learn about other people's perspectives, but I feel like it also helps. No journalist can be everywhere at once, especially with this information gap of journalists, largely not being allowed into, there's not a lot of journalists on the ground in Gaza right now. I think getting information from multiple sources can only be a good thing in better informing people of what is going on in different places, better informing people of other people's opinions, et cetera. And then the last thing that I'll say is so important when any of us are sharing information, again, whether it's for a news story or whether it's on a platform that we're using to be vocal, to just be transparent as possible about what their message is and why they're making that message. There was just an article that I was reading earlier this morning. I'm sure everybody heard about the the group of passengers that had landed in DC yesterday to attend the rally, and there was I guess there was a bus drivers strike. They decided that allegedly they didn't want to pick up these Jewish passengers and take them to the rally. I was appalled when I saw this, and I was looking for news coverage to see what I could share and like what I could amplify on that. And the reporting that I found, which was not a lot, there was not a lot of news coverage on this beyond what I had seen on, social media. The news coverage said that they had repeatedly asked the group on board what the name of the bus company was, and that they had repeatedly refused to provide the name of the bus company. Now, I can absolutely understand, knowing, how cancel culture works and, the anger of the internet. I can absolutely understand the need to not be transparent about what what the group was that decided allegedly to strike. I think that it really undermined that story, though, and I think that story probably is something that could have traveled much farther and really gotten on more radar if it was something that there was just a little bit more transparency about what, at least, or even to the journalists, if it was off the record, about who was refusing to pick up these passengers. So that my last point was just about transparency. I think it's important for us to be able to present as many facts as we can anywhere we can present them.
Thank you. And I should note, one of the highest number of casualties in any recent conflicts has been of journalists in this conflict. Let me just move on if we can, because we're about to get to some questions from the audience soon. Yuri, what is Moonshot doing to mitigate the threats of disinformation that is occurring online during this conflict, during this war? What can we do to help reinforce those efforts?
It's a great question. So at Moonshot, we really have sort of two streams of work. We have one is the insights, where we try to understand online harms, and then we also have interventions, where we provide services to people being affected by these online harms. So what I previously mentioned, the threat bulletin, that's part of our insights work. And so in this work that's going out to customers that include law enforcement, but not exclusively, we're highlighting the various strains of misinformation and conspiracy theories that are present in this conflict and that are leading to violent rhetoric and action as well. So we're sharing that with our people who need to know this kind of stuff. And not specific to this work, but as you mentioned, Moonshot does a lot of work in disinformation. And so we have various long-term projects that aim to safeguard against mis and disinformation. And this is done by educating audiences about common manipulation techniques and how information is sometimes presented online. So it's less about the specific facts of what's going on, but when you see examples of scapegoating or information presented that's missing context, we have these programs out there where people can see it and they can learn about how do I critically judge this information, or who is the source of this information, and what sort of narrative are they trying to tell me. So just to make people better consumers of media in general. And then finally, related to this and just focusing on other online harms like misinformation, Moonshot has a series of programs where we look at extremist rhetoric online, anti-Semitism online, and we try to connect these people with service providers, with mental health support, clinical service, and to sort of help de-radicalize people and push them away from committing some acts of anti-Semitic hate in real life. And so that's something that is a big part of Moonshot's work as well.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Let me see if we can get a quick question to Rachel real quick. You make videos in your spare time, so I want to take you out of your professional hat and break down. You do these walk and talk videos on Instagram. Forgetting about what you do during the day, what advice would you give to people who want to be responsible in their takes on this war without contributing to the noise of internet discourse? And I'd add, even when it doesn't quite fit in to your particular narrative. Thank you.
Sure. So I just super quickly want to address your previous question to me about Anthony Blinken and his what he said about too many civilians are dying, which is, I don't think that one world leader saying one thing about people of Gaza necessarily means that we're failing to convey our narrative. All it means is that Anthony Blinken is human and that he has compassion for the people of Gaza. And I think that all things considered, we are still super fortunate to have the support of all of our allies as much as we do. Moving on to your question just now about the videos I make in my spare time, the pointers that I would give about contributing to the social media discourse in a responsible way are the following. One, compassion. I would say that the most important thing to keep in mind when you're talking to people about a horrible, bloody war is compassion, and acknowledge that there are innocent people who are caught up in something that they didn't sign up for, and that this isn't a team sport. This is a complex situation that requires compassion. The next thing I would say is to use common sense in verifying the things that you're seeing before you share them. So not only relying on just, a verifiable news organization, but when you see influencers or things running around social media that seem, too weird to be true, or too good to be true, on either side, I would say, number one, do a bit of Googling before you share it. There have been so many quotes of Israeli leaders that I've immediately figured out were fake news on Instagram just by Googling the quote and the person's name, and saw that somebody had just made up a quote that they said and attributed it to them. Similarly, I've seen a bunch of videos going around Telegram and Instagram of people in Gaza saying things that really support our narrative, but it's them saying things that people put subtitles on that didn't match what they were saying at all. And all it took was me messaging one friend that speaks Arabic fluently and saying, hey, does this match what they're saying? And the answer was no. And so, I would just say that be incredibly cognizant that we don't need more fake news going around, and we don't need to give more ammo to the people who want to disenfranchise our side by saying that we're spreading fake news. We all have a responsibility to verify things that we see before we share them. The last thing I'll say is, talking to the audience of the Jewish Federation, I would say that one of the biggest gaps in the way that I was raised in my Jewish day school upbringing is what I call cherry tomato Zionism, which is essentially using talking points to say how good Israel is that are, just very generic things that don't have to do with what's going on in this incredibly complex situation. So the example of, Israel created cherry tomatoes, or Israel created the cell phone, or things like that. And that's why we should support everything they do. That isn't logical. That kind of education isn't going to stand up to when things are incredibly complicated. And even the line of Israel's the most, the IDF is the most moral military in the world. Well, people are dying and we're at war. And so I would say that we need to educate people to have the tools to have nuanced, complex conversations about the fact that people are dying and that there's a war, but it's still okay to support Israel because we're doing what we have to do. We were dragged into a war that we didn't want to be in. We're fighting a terrorist organization that wants a genocide of all Jews, not only in Israel, but around the world. And cherry tomato Zionism isn't going to cut it when having those kind of conversations. So I would say that, just to sum up, compassion, nuance, and verification are a good start.
All right. Thank you. And again, my point was, though, Tony Blinken's just not one of those yellow minions in the movie. He's one of the most steadfast allies, and that's why I brought it up. So I listened to him. But anyway, let's listen to some of our audience who are incredibly smart. I'm telling you. Let's get to a question real quick. I am a Holocaust educator at the Holocaust Museum here in LA. My question: how do I talk about disinformation and the current rise in anti-Semitism and hatred with students grades 5 to 12? What vocabulary and concepts should I include? And also, to be true and honest, of course. Can anyone provide some resources? How about Yuri from Moonshot?
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, I think some of the work that we put out and, similar organizations might be a little bit too complex, but that could be a good starting point for you to then sort of, you know, sort of adapt it to whatever age is appropriate. So lots of organizations like Moonshot, we put out explainers, we put out, public reports that describe, rising anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic tropes and sort of how they manifest. And I think a good resource might be looking at sort of like the slogans and the imagery that are common with anti-Semitism. So if students come across those online, particularly, there's been a lot of work discussing sort of how extremist movements use memes and humor to spread hate. So that's something that younger audiences could come across online, and I think it's important for them to know that the people who are producing this stuff, it's not just funny memes. There's lots of hatred behind it. So I would definitely take a look at Moonshot's work, take a look at the ADL's work. There'll be a good resource looking at sort of some of those. That'd be a good place to start.
All right, I just have, we only have a minute. So this is for Rachel. Quick question. It's kind of almost a yes or no here. Is the IDF command receptive to critical feedback from you about how their actions are being perceived or how they might do things better? Or is it just kind of go from the top?
I would say yes, receptive to feedback, of course, but keep in mind that there's a lot more going on than the public knows at any given time.
Well, thank you so much, all our panelists. Wow, what how incredibly informative. That's going to be it for us today. And again, thanks for each of our speakers for participating. I'm going to throw it back to Zev.
And again, thank you to Brian, and thank you to all of our panelists today. And thank you for tuning in to today's webinar, the latest webinars in our series, In Solidarity, in Strength. To support the efforts being made on the ground in Israel, please contribute to the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles' Israel Emergency Fund. To make your gift, please visit jewishla.org/Israel Crisis. With prayers for peace, wishing everyone a great rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.